Right. So our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward on the surface, but I think it's going to be a real challenge. We're taking a stack of source material that uses the structural transparency architecture, the STA framework, to map out one of the most, well, tricky areas in modern governance. We're talking about off-budget structures in security and defense.
And it has to be a challenge, right? Because
Mhm.
that very term, off budget, it's almost, I mean, it feels like it's designed to be vague. When people hear it, their minds immediately fill with all sorts of baggage.
Oh, absolutely. Instantaneously. Our default reaction is to jump straight to what the framework calls the narrative layer, the N layer.
Hmm.
We think of, dark money, hidden slush funds, or just outright conspiracy. And that narrative noise it's just deafening. It really obscures the mechanism.
And that's exactly where SDA helps. We're asking you, the listener, to try and look past that really noisy narrative, to look at the structure, the operating system, the OS layer that actually allows this thing to exist in the first place.
Mhm.
Because what the sources point out is that the vagueness isn't a bug. It's not a flaw in the system. It's actually a feature of the structure itself.
Okay, a feature. Let's dig into that. So the sources are saying off-budget isn't. It's not a physical bank account somewhere waiting to be raided. It's a condition, a result of history. How does that happen? How does history create a condition like this?
Well, the STA framework puts it in a really powerful way. It calls it a refuge for rationality.
A refuge for rationality.
Yeah, and that's the key insight here. The initial reason for these structures, it was completely rational. At certain points in time, we're talking high-threat moments, systemic crises, there were reasonable, necessary decisions about security that
Yeah.
they were structurally impossible to make through the normal budget process.
You mean the standard system, the on-budget system, was actually getting in the way of necessary rational security measures?
Exactly. I mean, think about it. If you need to protect a critical asset or respond to a threat in, say, a few days, and the legislative budget process takes months, sometimes years, well, those critical decisions need a refuge, right? A place where they can be acted on swiftly, rationally. That's the origin point. That's where this off-budget condition starts.
So what we're really examining here is the journey, the path from that initial temporary need, that crisis moment, and how it morphs into a permanent, ongoing system, from an emergency to what the sources call a permanent exception OS.
That is the path, yes.
Okay, let's stick with the origins for a second then. Was it really universally true that these initial expenses, whether it was for, I don't know, Cold War stuff, new intelligence platforms, or helping out an ally, were they genuinely necessary? Did they have to be exceptions?
According to the material, yes. They were rational responses to threats, where time was the most valuable, non-renewable resource you had. You simply couldn't wait for this standard, the on-budget OS. The core necessity was speed, operational velocity.
Right. If the parliamentary cycle needs 18 months to approve an asset, but the crisis on the ground needs a response in 48 hours, that's a fundamental mismatch.
It's a velocity gap. That mismatch is the structural friction. And if your national security depends on a pace that conventional budget controls just can't handle, you have to create a parallel structure. So the first exception, it's not malicious, it's purely functional.
But the sources really hammer this point home. The key isn't the first exception, it's the repetition. What happens structurally when you repeat these exceptions over and over, decade after decade?
The sources are very clear on this. Repetition is what transforms the structure. Those temporary measures, things like supplementary wartime funding or some classified procurement funds, they don't just vanish when the initial crisis seems to fade.
They stick around.
They get renewed, constantly. Because the threat environment or the political situation that makes speed so important, it becomes perpetual, permanent.
So the temporary exceptions start to solidify.
They absolutely do. They transfer from being these ad hoc, one-off things into constant budget-out funds. They start to formalize. They become independent structures, a kind of specialized, purpose-specific OS that just runs in parallel to the government's main slow operating system. It's a loop, a self-reinforcing loop, where that rational need for speed becomes the permanent scaffolding for an exceptional way of governing.
That makes the next question absolutely critical then. When does that exception stop being temporary? When does it start to define the permanent structure of the state? When does that refuge for rationality start running the whole show?
It happens at what the analysis calls the structural runaway point. This is the moment where swiftness goes from being just a high value to being the single optimized value. It's prized above everything else.
Above accountability,
Yeah.
above oversight.
Especially above accountability and oversight. And when that happens, the structure starts to run on its own, autonomously.
And that kind of optimization must create just massive friction with the normal, slow democratic system.
It creates what STA calls the velocity gap, or shear. It's a great metaphor. Think of a huge, slow-moving oil tanker. That's your standard democratic oversight.
Mm.
It's driven by budget cycles, public hearings, accountability reports.
Deliberate, slow.
Very slow. Now compare that to a high-velocity military jet. That's the operational security layer. It's optimized for immediate, non-public action. They're moving in fundamentally different time layers.
So they're not just moving at different speeds, they're kind of existing in different conceptual timeframes.
Precisely. And that massive gap between the slow time of accountability and the fast time of operations, it creates immense pressure. The fast layer starts to see the slow layer not just as an inconvenience, but as an active threat to its own success.
Which brings us to this really radical idea in the sources, the logic reversal. If speed is the only thing that matters, then the tools of democratic control, they have to be neutralized somehow. How does the system do that?
The reversal is, it's profound. Because swiftness is constantly needed, it's validated by these ongoing long-term crises. So the very idea of pre-approval is structurally recast as a security risk.
Wait, say that again? Asking for permission is a security risk.
Yes. If waiting for Congress or Parliament to sign off on a budget risks national security, then the very mechanism of oversight, the check and balance, becomes the enemy of success.
So the guardrails of accountability become the liability. That is a fundamental inversion of governance.
And the consequence of that inversion is this dramatic shift in what national consent even means. Consent stops being the premise of making a decision. The state has to get permission before it does something. Instead, consent becomes the object of post facto explanation. The state acts first, immediately, and then it provides a justification or an explanation after the fact.
And parliamentary control just gets reduced to formal reporting, a rubber stamp after the event.
Structurally, yes. Because the operational need has demanded a speed that is so far beyond the capacity of oversight, control shifts entirely to post facto reporting, which is, by definition, a reduction of accountability.
So if the ability to bypass oversight is the whole point, we have to redefine what state capacity even is. State power can't just be about the size of the official budget anymore, can it?
That's the critical synthesis from the source material. Exactly. If we just observe the operational metric, how the state actually functions, power is no longer measured by how much money is available in those official slow accounts. It's measured by how much exception the state can successfully operate.
So the real metric of power becomes the volume and speed of its independent actions.
That's the structural observation, yes. We're just mapping the operational dynamics. And the conclusion is that once a system hits this point, the original term emergency has fully transitioned. It's now a permanent operating mode, a permanent exception OS.
And this system is successful. It delivers the swiftness it was designed for. But because this high-speed OS runs without a translation layer back to the main public OS, it automatically creates the very public distrust that fuels that dark money narrative we started with.
That's the ultimate structural paradox. The system works because it's successful at its mission. But its very point, success makes it opaque and therefore suspect. And without a defined termination condition, a TTL, it just keeps going. It self-sustains. Its function is validated by the continuation of the very crisis it was built to solve.
Now, hearing this, it's very easy for a listener to think, okay, this sounds like a problem specific to one country, maybe a nation with a huge bureaucracy or a weak legislative branch. Is this a localized political issue?
The sources are emphatic on this point. It's not country-specific. This dynamic, this conflict between the need for operational speed and the constraints of democratic control, it's a universal condition. It's common to all advanced states trying to manage long-term, low-intensity crises, especially in security and defense.
Then why does it look so different from country to country?
The difference is really about arrangement and perception. In some national systems, these off-budget mechanisms are all concentrated. They might be under a single, very visible name, like a specific special account. That concentration makes the whole anomaly easy to see. It becomes a kind of reference model for analysts.
Because it's all in one place, you can point to it.
Exactly. But in other systems, and this is common in the English-speaking world, the same structural pieces are dispersed. They're scattered across all sorts of different vehicles, special purpose vehicles, government-sponsored entities, quasi-fiscal activities.
So the effect is identical, but the structure is just harder to map because it's distributed everywhere. You'd have to track dozens of different entities just to see the full pattern.
Precisely. So whether you concentrate the exception or disperse it, The underlying structural conditions are identical everywhere. The need for a high-velocity OS, the creation of a purpose-specific OS, the velocity gap, the lack of a translation layer. It's an unavoidable dynamic when time and speed are your primary metrics.
You know, this analysis, focusing just on the structural map, it's deeply clarifying. But because STA is strictly a map and not a reform proposal, it does intentionally leave us without any easy answers or policy solutions.
And that's the point. Our goal here isn't to prescribe a solution. It's to leave some conceptual space for you, the listener, to just reflect on the nature of a structure that is now running on its own. We're only focusing on the questions about how this permanent exception OS functions and endures.
So if the system is, by its own metrics, successful, it gets the job done fast. What are the structural questions we should be left with?
I think the biggest one is about persistence. We have to ask, where can a termination condition, a TTL, possibly exist inside a structure that is both successful and self-sustaining? If the structure's success validates its own existence, and the crisis it was built for never really goes away, who or what structurally has the power to press the off button?
And if the structure sees its own mission as protection, it's inherently going to resist any outside force that tries to shut it down.
Absolutely. The structure protects itself because its mission is protection. Which leads to the final question. When does a successful optimized structure become truly untouchable? Untouchable by any external force, including the slow, democratic oversight system it was designed to escape in the first place.
That really is the essential challenge this deep dive brings to light. It makes you realize that understanding off-budget isn't really about finding corruption. It's about recognizing the constraints of time and speed right at the heart of governance.
And this may not be about understanding in the end. It might just be about noticing where we stand while observing this self-perpetuating system in the operational landscape.